Diana lay motionless among the shattered remnants of the vampire command base, her crimson eyes the only part of her that could still move with purpose, tracking the shadows that danced across the ruined walls as the foreign sun climbed higher in the strange sky, painting everything in shades of orange and gold that she had learned to despise. And she knew that soon, very soon, those rays would begin to burn her immortal flesh, turning her pale skin black as ash, and there was nothing she could do to stop it because her body would not obey her anymore. Had not obeyed her for 2 days now, ever since the humans deployed that terrible nerve agent that rippled through the vampire ranks like a wave of paralysis, stealing movement and leaving only awareness. Only the horrible clarity of a mind trapped in a corpse. She remembered the moment it happened. The way the air had turned thick and caustic around her, burning her lungs even as she tried to flee, and then the falling, the endless tumbling as her legs simply stopped responding to her desperate commands, and the screaming from her soldiers. So many of them, all around her in the darkness, their voices cutting off one by one as the toxin spread through their nervous systems and left them as helpless as broken puppets. And then the confusion of the retreat, the urgent shouting of the commanders, ordering everyone who could still move to leave the base, to save the war effort, to prioritize the Empire above all else, which meant leaving behind anyone too weak or too poisoned to run. No one had even looked back at her. Not once, and why should they have? She thought bitterly. What use was a paralyzed vampire in a war? What value did she have now, except to slow down anyone foolish enough to try to help her? And so they had left her there in the dust and the rubble, her beautiful green dress torn and stained with blood and ash, her dark hair spread out on the cold ground like it was some kind of offering to the gods. Though she had stopped believing in gods long ago, had stopped believing in most things except duty and obligation, and the endless weight of being born into a noble family that had made all her decisions for her. She had been nothing but a piece on a board her entire existence, a tool meant to serve the vampire empire, first as a scholar because she showed aptitude for languages and diplomacy, then as a bride because she came from a powerful family and her marriage to Thrakish would unite two houses and strengthen the empire's genetic lines. And she had accepted this with the same resignation that she had accepted everything else in her 500 years of immortal life, moving through the world like a ghost, completing each task assigned to her without question or rebellion. And now, finally, the universe had ended all of it with a toxin and a terrible, perfect mercy. The pain in her paralyzed body was strange, not sharp, but deep and aching, like her muscles were screaming without making a sound, and she could not scratch the itch on her face or turn her head away from the light or do anything except lie there and exist and wait for the sun to climb high enough to kill her. And she thought that this might be the most honest moment of her entire existence, this moment of total helplessness, because she had spent 500 years pretending to have control over her life when she had never had any at all. And now at least everyone could see the truth written plain on her paralyzed body, that she had always been nothing but a puppet, just with the illusion of movement before she had learned about human philosophy during her studies. Those strange concepts about individual will and personal choice, and the radical idea that a person should be allowed to decide their own fate. And she had dismissed those ideas as primitive nonsense then. The desperate fantasies of creatures who did not understand hierarchy or duty or the proper order of things. But lying there in the dust with her limbs completely unresponsive, she wondered if perhaps the humans had been onto something after all, if perhaps that primitive philosophy contained some grain of truth that her advanced civilization had somehow managed to lose along the way, grinding it into dust beneath the weight of empire and tradition. The shadows grew longer as the day passed, and she could feel the temperature dropping as evening approached, which meant another night was coming, and after the night would come another day, and the sun would rise and set and rise again. And she would still be lying here in the ruins, aware and awake and utterly unable to move. And she did not know how long a vampire body could survive like this. Whether the paralysis would eventually kill her through starvation, or whether she would simply persist in this terrible state indefinitely. Immortal and helpless and absolutely alone, she thought about Thrakish, her intended husband. And she wondered if he was still alive, or if he had fallen in the battle. And then she realized that it did not matter, that she would never know. That she would never marry him, or bear his children, or play the role of war bride that had been written for her in some distant planning chamber by politicians and generals, who had never asked what she wanted. And instead of grief, she felt something that might have been relief, a strange, guilty relief that at least this burden had been taken from her. That she would not have to smile and pretend and perform her duty in a marriage bed with a vampire lord who viewed her as nothing more than a political alliance. The sky turned purple and then black, and the stars came out, brilliant and cold and utterly indifferent to her suffering. And Diana stared up at them with her wide red eyes and waited for either rescue or death, though she expected neither and wanted neither. And she made a decision in the darkness, made it quietly and without ceremony, that if she was going to die here, then at least she would die as herself, not as a noble, not as a bride, not as a political tool, but simply as Diana, whoever that person might actually be. And it was the first truly free thought she had ever had. And it came to her in a ruined alien base surrounded by the corpses of her people. And she closed her eyes and surrendered to whatever would come next. Jake Morrison had been a soldier for 8 years and a field medic for 6 of those years. And in all that time, he had learned to expect the worst from every situation, to trust his training and his instincts, and to accept that in a war against an alien species that wanted to colonize human space, mercy was often the first thing to die. And so he moved through the ruins of the vampire command base with his rifle raised and his heart steady, scanning for threats, looking for salvageable technology, anything that might give the colonial forces an advantage in their desperate fight for survival. The base was eerily quiet, which was the most dangerous kind of quiet, the kind that made experienced soldiers nervous, because quiet meant hidden enemies and booby traps and ambush waiting in the shadows. And so Jake moved slowly, carefully, checking each corner before advancing, his combat boots crunching on broken glass and rubble. The afternoon light streaming through massive holes torn in the metal walls by artillery fire, and he was so focused on the danger ahead of him that he almost missed the slight movement in the pile of bodies near the far corner of the main chamber. Jake stopped immediately, his finger moving to the trigger of his rifle, but something in that movement was wrong. Too subtle, too controlled to be a threat, and he approached cautiously, ready to fire, but also ready to help if there was any chance of a survivor. Because that was what separated humans from the monsters they were fighting. The willingness to help even when it might be dangerous, even when the victim might be an enemy. And as he got closer, he saw the red eyes watching him with perfect clarity from a face so pale it might have been carved from marble. He froze for just a moment, his brain processing the fact that the creature beneath the pile of corpses was a vampire. One of the nobility by the look of the remnants of expensive clothing still clinging to her body. And she was not moving anything except her eyes, just watching him with an expression that might have been resignation or acceptance or something else entirely. Something almost like relief. Jake slowly lowered his rifle, keeping it ready but no longer pointed directly at her. And he approached with the same careful movements he would have used approaching any wounded animal. The kind that was dangerous by nature, but currently helpless. And he knelt down beside her, studying her face, noting the intelligence in those crimson eyes. The awareness that looked back at him was something that felt almost like understanding. "What happened to you?" he asked in standard colonial English, the language that had become common enough among the soldiers that most humans could manage the basics. And he watched as the vampire woman's eyes moved slightly, tracking his face, and then her lips moved, forming words in that same English, though her accent was strange and formal, shaped by a voice that probably had not spoken in days. "I am paralyzed," she said, her voice dry and hoarse but steady, stronger than Jake would have expected. "The nerve agent used against my people affects the nervous system. It stopped my body from moving but not from thinking, not from understanding. And I've been lying here waiting for your son to kill me, which seemed like a more merciful death than being captured and interrogated. And I have made peace with this, so I would prefer if you would simply end it quickly. A bullet through the skull would be efficient." Jake stared at her, and he felt something shift inside his chest, something that his military training said was dangerous and naive. A feeling that had no place in a war, but he could not ignore it, could not walk away from this creature who had just calmly asked him to execute her, because there was no malice in her request, no manipulation or deception, just a straightforward acknowledgement of her circumstances and a rational preference for a quick death over a slow one. And Jake had been trained to recognize lies. And this was not a lie. "What is your name?" Jake asked. And he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, surprise perhaps, or maybe just curiosity about why he was asking. And she answered after a moment, "Diana, I am Diana. And I was promised to a warlord named Threkish in a marriage that will now never occur, which brings me unexpected relief. And I have no military intelligence that will be worth the trouble of keeping me alive. So there is no tactical reason to preserve my life." Jake Morrison was many things, but he was not a killer of helpless prisoners. Even beautiful vampire prisoners with red eyes and dark hair and a calm acceptance of their own death. And he felt the weight of the war, the exhaustion of fighting creatures that seemed so much more powerful and advanced than humanity. And he made a decision that would change everything. A decision that his commanding officers would probably court-martial him for if they found out. But he made it anyway, because he was tired of death, tired of blood, tired of the endless machinery of worry, and not going to kill you. He said simply, and he watched Diana's eyes widen slightly, the first real emotion he had seen cross her face. And he continued, "I'm going to get you out of here. I am going to treat your injuries. I am going to find a way to reverse this paralysis if I can. And then we are going to figure out what comes next. Because you are not a threat to me right now, and you are not a piece of tactical equipment. You are just a person who has been abandoned by your own people. I understand what that feels like, and I'm going to help you." Diana stared at him for a long moment, her crimson eyes searching his face as if she was trying to understand the logic of his decision, as if helping a paralyzed vampire made any rational sense whatsoever. And Jake could see the moment when she realized he was serious, when she understood that this human soldier was actually going to break every military regulation and every common sense directive in order to keep her alive. And he saw tears begin to form in those red eyes. Tears that might have been the first tears she had cried in 500 years. "You are making a mistake," Diana whispered, but there was no force behind the words. They were just a formality, an acknowledgement of the obvious. Because she had been ready to die, had made peace with it. And now suddenly there was possibility again. There was hope again, and she did not know what to do with hope. Had never really had it before, and Jake Morrison, this human soldier with his steady hands and his kind eyes, was offering her something her entire civilization had never given her, a choice and a chance at something more. The abandoned communications tent became Jake's makeshift medical facility, a space hidden from the main camp where he could work without drawing attention or questions he did not want to answer. And he told his unit commander that he was cataloging captured intelligence documents. which was technically true since Diana spent hours talking to him about vampire, military structure, and the nerve agent that had been deployed against her people. And Jake recorded everything, taking notes that he would eventually submit to Colonial Command. But those notes would conveniently omit the fact that his information source was still alive and receiving medical care from him personally. He carried supplies from the medical tent. Bottles of water and nutrition paste, designed for human soldiers, but better than nothing for someone whose body had started to slowly consume itself. And he fashioned a feeding tube from medical equipment that was never meant to be used this way. And he helped Diana drink water by carefully tilting her head, trying not to think about how intimate this care had become, how he was learning the exact angle of her neck that made swallowing easier, the way her eyes closed momentarily when the water reached her throat, the small sounds of gratitude she made that were barely more than whispers, inventoried every medication in the Colonial Medical Database, searching for anything that might counteract vampire nerve toxins. And he sat with Diana for hours while she described the chemical composition of the agent that had paralyzed her. And he slowly began to understand the structure, began to develop theories about compounds that might block or reverse the damage. And Diana watched him work with those red eyes that never blinked. And she answered his questions with the precision of someone who'd once been a scholar, who understood science and medicine the way few other vampires did. And slowly, a partnership began to form between them in the darkness of the tent. With no one watching, Jake would sit beside Diana and talk about his life, about growing up in the colonial frontier, about becoming a medic because he wanted to save lives instead of take them, about the guilt he felt every time someone died, despite his best efforts. And Diana would listen with an attention that was so complete, it felt almost like love. Though Jake told himself it was not love, it could not be love. It was just the intimacy of proximity in crisis and the strange honesty that forms when two people are sharing survival. And Diana, who had never been asked what she thought anything, who had spent 500 years being told what to think and feel and do, began to speak for the first time in her existence, began to tell Jake about the loneliness of her privileged position, the way her beauty and her noble birth had made her a target rather than a person, the way she had been treated as an ornament to be displayed and eventually used as a political tool. And Jake listened the way few people ever listened, with complete attention and respect, as if her words mattered, as if she mattered beyond her usefulness or her strategic value. On the fifth day, Diana's fingers twitched, a movement so small that Jake almost missed it. But he saw it, and he felt his heart surge with hope. And he began a treatment protocol with compounds he had carefully synthesized from the vampire nerve agent samples that Diana had helped him identify. And he injected the serum directly into her bloodstream. And he sat with her through the night, checking her vitals, watching for any sign of improvement or adverse reaction. And in the hours before dawn, Diana's eyes were no longer the only thing she could move. Her hand moved next, fingers flexing against the blanket that covered her. And she made a sound that might have been laughter or might have been tears. And Jake held her hand, and he realized that he was in love with this vampire woman. Had been since the moment he saw the intelligence and the resignation in those red eyes. Had been since the moment she asked him to kill her and he chose to save her instead. And he knew this was impossible and dangerous and would destroy his career and potentially his life. But he also knew that he did not care. The paralysis receded slowly over the following days, Diana regaining control of her body in gradual waves. First her fingers and hands, then her arms. Then the sensation returning to her legs, though the movement was still weak and painful. And Jake worked with her through physical therapy, supporting her as she learned to sit up, to move her legs, to remember how to walk in a body that had been still for so long. And with each movement she regained, he could see the light growing stronger in her eyes, the hope transforming from fragile to real. the sense that her life might actually continue beyond this place. This tent, these impossible circumstances. Diana asked him one night, while they were resting between exercises, why he had chosen to help her. Why he had risked so much for someone who was technically his enemy. And Jake considered the question seriously, because he wanted to give her an answer that was truthful. And he said that it was because she asked him to kill her, and he did not want to. Because she was a person trapped in a system that had never seen her as a person. And because every person deserved the chance to choose their own fate. And Diana cried then, openly and without shame. Because in 500 years, no one had ever said anything like that to her before. And she realized that the humans, the primitive creatures her civilization had deemed almost beneath notice, had understood something about dignity and worth that her own people had forgotten long ago. The message came through the encrypted channels in the middle of the night. And Jake knew immediately that his time of secrecy had ended, because the Vampire Empire had discovered that Diana had been captured instead of killed, and they were sending a retrieval team, which meant a squad of elite vampire soldiers who would kill her on sight to prevent interrogation. And Jake felt his stomach drop as he realized that every choice he had made to help Diana, every sacrifice and risk, would mean nothing if he could not find a way to protect her from her own people. He showed Diana the message without trying to hide the truth, because she deserved to know, deserved to understand the danger that her survival had created. And he watched her face as she understood what was coming. And he saw something shift behind her red eyes, a hardness that had not been there before, a warrior's focus that suggested she had not forgotten how to be the noble of a powerful family, how to think strategically about survival and power. They have to kill me, Diana said calmly, because I have seen how the humans treat prisoners. I know that I will be interrogated, and I will tell you everything, because I cannot withstand human torture the way other vampires can. One lack the mental training that the military receives. And once I have told you everything, they cannot allow me to live. It is logical. It is strategic. It is how empires survive. And she looked at him with eyes that held no fear, but only acceptance of the logic of war. Jake wanted to tell her that she was wrong, that he would never let anything happen to her, that he had already risked everything for her, and he would continue to risk everything. But he also realized that Diana was not asking for reassurance. She was presenting the facts as she understood them. And she was preparing herself for death, because that was what her experience had taught her to do. Because her entire life had been about accepting impossible circumstances and making the best of them. But you told me I had choices, Diana continued, and I am choosing now. I am choosing not to be helpless again. I am choosing to fight. And you can help me do that if you want to, or you can walk away and pretend you never found me. And I will understand either way, but I am not going back to my empire. And I will not die without making the attempt to survive. And Jake realized in that moment that he had given Diana something that had transformed her from a victim into a person with agency. And he was not going to take that back. They worked through the night, planning, strategizing, using Diana's knowledge of vampire military tactics and Jake's understanding of human warfare to construct a defense that should not have been possible. Two people standing against a trained military unit, and they knew the odds were against them, knew that they would probably die, but they also knew that they had to try, because surrender was not an option anymore. And neither was passivity. They created defensive positions in the ruins, using the same debris and rubble that had hidden Diana as shelter and weapon storage. And Jake taught Diana how to use a human rifle. And Diana taught Jake the vulnerable points in vampire physiology, the places where their superior strength mattered less than tactical positioning and speed. And they lay in the darkness together and waited for dawn. And the proximity of their certain death made everything else seem trivial and distant when the retrieval team arrived. They came with the confidence of creatures who expected to find a helpless prisoner and an isolated human soldier. And they were not prepared for the coordinated attack that met them. Not prepared for the human with advanced medical knowledge who had survived a vampire base by himself for weeks. Not prepared for the noble who turned her own people into enemies with the calmness of someone who had finally claimed her own fate. And the first vampire fell to a sniper shot before they even understood where the attack was coming from. The battle lasted only minutes, though it felt like hours, and when it ended, 3 vampires lay dead and 2 had retreated, damaged and confused and unable to explain to their commanders how they had been defeated by a single human and a paralyzed bride. And Jake and Diana sat in the dust of their victory and realized that they had just declared war on the vampire empire, not with weapons or military power, but with the simple act of refusing to accept the roles that had been assigned to them. Jake held Diana's hand as the adrenaline faded, and he asked if she regretted her choice, and she looked at him with those red eyes that were no longer empty with resignation, but full of something that looked like hope. And she answered that she had spent 500 years making other people's choices. And finally, she was making her own. And that made her regret nothing. Not the paralysis, not the abandonment, not the fight they had just won. Nothing except the 500 years of time that could never be recovered. And Jake pulled her close, and they sat together in the ruins of the military base. 2 beings from different species who had chosen each other over empire and duty and destiny. The military inquiry lasted 3 days, and Jake sat in a conference room with 6 high-ranking colonial officers while they asked him questions about his actions and his decisions and his choice to care for a vampire, prisoner without authorization or proper oversight. And he prepared himself for court-martial, for imprisonment, for the end of his career, and possibly his freedom. But then Diana was brought into the room, no longer paralyzed but moving with careful deliberation, and she began to speak in her formal, scholarly English about vampire weaknesses and internal conflicts and divisions within the empire that the humans had never even suspected. She talked about how the vampire empire was not a monolithic force, but rather a collection of competing families and warlords who would turn on each other if given the opportunity. She described the economic systems that vulnerable to disruption. She outlined the military weak points that no human intelligence had ever discovered. And she did this not under duress or interrogation, but voluntarily, because she had made a choice, because she had decided that her future lay not with an empire that had been willing to leave her to die, but with humans who had chosen to save. The officers watched and listened and slowly began to understand that what they had perceived as a massive liability might actually be an unprecedented strategic advantage. And the court-martial charges were quietly dropped, replaced instead with a new classification for Diana, not as a prisoner of war but as a foreign intelligence advisor, a position that gave her protection under international law and also gave her something she had never had before: official status and recognition, and a place where her knowledge and her voice actually mattered. Months passed, and Diana's treatment for the nerve toxin paralysis continued to improve. And Jake worked with researchers from the Colonial Medical Corps to perfect the compound he had created. And together, they developed something remarkable: a treatment that could reverse the effects of the vampire nerve agent, which meant that the thousands of vampires who had been paralyzed by human weapons now had a chance at recovery. And though the Empire tried to suppress this information, word began to spread among the vampire populations. And Diana received messages from creatures who had been left behind as she had been left behind. Creatures who were beginning to understand that there might be an alternative to empire and duty. Diana was asked to serve as a liaison between the human colonial forces and those vampires who were beginning to question their empire. And she accepted this role not with the resignation that had defined her entire existence, but with the sense that she was finally doing something that mattered, something that she had chosen, something that was genuinely hers, and Jake remained at her side, her partner and her protector and the witness to her transformation from a victim into an architect of change a year after the battle in the ruins. Diana and Jake attended a secret meeting in a cave system far from any military installation, where vampires from 3 different noble families had gathered, all of them having experienced the same abandonment that Diana had experienced, all of them questioning the empire that had been willing to let them die. And Diana stood before her and spoke about choice and agency and the possibility of a future that was not dictated by birth or tradition. And she watched as these creatures, who had lived for centuries under the weight of imperial duty, began to understand that another way was possible. Jake watched her speak, and he felt pride and love in something else that he did not have words for. A sense that he was witnessing the birth of something new, a world where humans and vampires might work together, where the assumptions and prejudices of thousands of years could be questioned and possibly dismantled. And it all started because he had chosen mercy instead of protocol, chosen to help instead of harm, chosen to see Diana not as an enemy or a strategic asset, but as a person. Diana and Jake became the foundation of something larger than either of them had anticipated. A growing movement of vampires and humans who believed that cooperation was possible, that the war did not have to define the entire future of their species. And though the vampire empire and the human government viewed them with suspicion, though there were forces on both sides who worked to suppress their movement, they continued to grow, continued to build bridges across the impossible gulf that had separated their peoples. Years later, when historians look back at this period of war and transformation, they would point to the moment when a paralyzed vampire bride was abandoned in the ruins and a human soldier chose mercy. And they would say that this single act of compassion, this one instance of choosing connection over fear, had changed the trajectory of their entire civilization. And Diana and Jake, who had never intended to be revolutionary or historical figures, had simply lived according to their convictions, believing that every individual deserved dignity and choice and the chance to shape their own future, and in believing that they had created possibilities that neither of them could have imagined on that day when Diana lay paralyzed in the dust, waiting for death that never came.